Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Randy Beyer, and we're going to talk about some academic books and academic issues. What I want to start with is The Moral Arc, How Science and Reason Lead Humanity Toward Truth, Justice, and Freedom by Michael Shermer. How's that for a big start?
That's a tome.
Yeah.
Even the thought concept is a tome. I'm trying to wrap my head around that. The meaning, according to morality.
Well, it's quite relevant.
I'm being facetious. I'm sure it's worth a read.
It's quite relevant, actually, because of all the events that have happened just the last couple months, where we had the shootings in Charleston and other things, and the point that he's making is that the moral arc, according to what Martin Luther King said and others like Theodore Parker, that ultimately it bends toward justice. And I think at this time in our nation's history we need to remember that, because they're talking here about a previous time in 1965 in Selma, Alabama, when they had the march and all the conflict there. And, it's just been devastating to watch this long series of things. But he says, my aim is to show that Reverends Parker and King were right, that the arc of the moral universe does indeed bend toward justice. In addition to religious conscience and stirring rhetoric, we can trace the moral arc through science with data from many different lines of inquiry, all of which demonstrate that in general, as a species, we are becoming increasingly moral. And
I hope we are.
Well, I think that's something that is a positive thing that people need to remember as we're doing this, because it's easy to become overwhelmed by the sadness and the tragedy and the issues that happen. But I think this also frames a larger discussion, and here they talk about what the moral arc is. He calls this metaphor, the bending moral arc, as perhaps the most important and least appreciated trend in human history. We all want to believe the other, that it's becoming worse. And he talks about moral as manner, character, proper behavior. And I think that that's a useful lesson to keep in mind as we try to deal with what we have in front of us, because there's a lot of problems that we've had when people have gotten into some kind of weird, situation. He says that the number of studies and lines of evidence in support of the hypothesis is that, for example, intelligence and education negatively correlated with violent crime. Cognitive style predicts criminal justice attitudes. Abstract reasoning ability is positively correlated with the cooperation in a game called Prisoner's Dilemma. So there's a number of those things where he's talking about what science has come up with. But it's really refreshing to read something that points toward a positive evolution of our troubles and moral dilemmas.
Is he using Dr. King as one of the primary fulcrums or points of discussion in the book?
There's a specific example.
It's one example, right. Is this a historical look at questions or moral questions through the history of Western culture, or is he looking at a kind of worldwide, cross-cultural sort of?
It's a very philosophical approach. of applying methods of science to solve social and moral problems. And it's quite a chunk to take in, because he's dealing at the core of it.
Yeah.
And I thought it was useful to start this program with this discussion because of some of the issues that we're dealing with. You know, let me get farther along in here. So,
Well, it's interesting how over time science has been looking back on science. You can see how the moral imperative of science was manipulated by, you know, for lack of a better word, cultural points of view at the time. I mean, you look at racial science, right, of the 17th century, the 19th century, the 18th century, I suppose maybe even today. But I mean, we have one human species, and yet, you know, the human is one species, but we've broken it apart because of science into myriad parts called
what was
races,
interesting,
ethnicities, nationality. I mean, we've done an enormous number of manipulations. You think that science is neutral, but it's not at all.
well, and like something that I find with my students, they're always saying, because I start them off by looking at a specific moment in their lives as the basis for an essay. And then their next question is, well, how could a moment in my life, how could there
Have
be
meaning
research
or-
on that?
Right.
And I tell them once you put it into context,
Right.
and they find out that's true.
Actually, I have to correct what I just said. I said science is not neutral at all. It's actually science in the hands of humans, maybe, is not neutral. I mean, I do believe that, and this is, I guess this is my own training in Western, the belief in the scientific method. Maybe this can be questioned too, what reality is. But, you know, when something drops, we have, you know, the laws of the universe, that gravity and whatnot. Over time, that's until something else changes, that we discover something. I mean, that's a law, right? It's something beyond culture and humans. It's something that is there as a physical thing. I mean, I do believe that, but it's not neutral in the sense that people use that to make policy, to make, you know, to make war, to do all kinds of other things with it.
Well, there's a synergy between event and interpretation of the event. As an example, as we sit here, there's a huge thing going on in Greece and in Europe about whether Greece is going to go bankrupt or not. And there's another controversy over our president, Barack Obama, you know, with the trade agreements. And here's a thing on trade, commerce, and conflict. And he quotes this 19th century French economist, Frédéric Bastiat, who first articulated the concept that where goods do not cross frontiers, armies will. But where goods do cross frontiers, armies will not. I thought that was just quite interesting. I thought that was just quite an interesting thing. We need
Trade embargoes are the wrong
we
thing
need to
to
be
do.
remembered to think about the dynamics of our economic
Yeah, right.
evolution.
Right, and by the same token, I suppose economic theory, being a science, is also a very strong paradigm that runs, I mean, you mentioned Greece, the belief in the way that the explanations of the banking system or of the way the economies of modern economies are run in the West are based on principles we call scientific, but they justify a certain type of approach.
When the Greeks
Whether
wanted to walk away from the European Union, you know, and then they found out, whoops, it's a little more complicated than that because their debt is so intertwined with the International Monetary Fund and other European states
Right.
that they can't just walk away.
Right. By the same token, the monetary fund probably runs its principles based on a science of economics that, may benefit those in power. I mean, I'm just throwing this out as speculation. A philosopher would look at this in a totally more analytical point of view, I imagine, and sort of call up the. I mean, I'm not a philosopher, so they have unique ways of interpreting.
Well, another point that Shermer makes is it's not quite as simple binaries.
It's
good,
very
bad.
true, yeah.
Because he says you need to use a continuous scale, and that reveals more subtle but very real effects. So, like the Greeks, they may want to walk away. It's either in or out, but it's not that simple.
Not that simple. That's very true. Out may not be in, and in may not be out, or the other way around. Out may be in. I don't know.
Another one is religion. He argues that religion is not the source of moral progress.
In the sense that religion is selfish?
It has its own
sees its own
purpose.
Salvation first. Right. Right. I say right. I don't know if you and I are agreeing, but I think he might be on that aspect of it. I mean, religion is meant to self-preserve, isn't it?
Here's an interesting thing from the Dalai Lama's Facebook entry on September 10, 2012. All the world's major religions, with their emphasis on love, compassion, patience, tolerance, and forgiveness, can and do promote inner values. But the reality of the world today is that grounding ethics in religion is no longer adequate. This is why I'm increasingly convinced that the time has come to find a way of thinking about spirituality and ethics beyond religion altogether.
And that's the Dalai Lama speaking.
Yeah. And I think that's a useful thing to think about. Because we're so globally connected, you can't just do something and forget about it.
Right.
It affects somebody else. And then he says, why religion cannot be the driver of moral progress. Moses did not come down from the mountain with a detailed list of the ways in which the Israelites could make life better for the Moabites, Edomites, Midianites, or any other tribe of people that happened not to be them. One justification for this constricted sphere can be found in the Old Testament injunction to love thy neighbor. And the question is, who precisely
is the neighbor? Yeah, who do you call your neighbor?
John Harton, anthropologist, defined neighbor as one's immediate kin and kind. The phrase, love thy neighbor as thyself, comes from the Torah. The word Torah means law, and the Torah is the law. If Moses had been transmitting the word of God to modern biologists, he might have said, love your neighbor as if R equals 1, minus as if all your genes are identical. So it's a pretty wide-ranging discussion. Here's, is religion responsible for Western civilization? Religious believers will often argue that Christianity gave Western civilization its most precious assets: art, architecture, literature, music, science, technology, capitalism, democracy, equal rights, and the rule of law. The question of religion's role in shaping of the West is an empirical one, which the popular conservative Christian apologist Dinesh D'Souza attempts to answer in his 2000 book, What's So Great About Christianity? Western civilization was built by Christianity, D'Souza proclaims. The West was built on two pillars, Athens and Jerusalem. By Athens I mean classical civilization, the civilization of Greece and pre-Christian Rome. By Jerusalem I mean Judaism and Christianity. Of these two, Jerusalem is more important.
Hmm.
So there's these different influences, and then you come into capitalism, and Rodney Stark claims that the commitment to manual labor that so distinguishes Christian aestheticism from that found in other religious cultures where piety is associated with rejection of the world and its activities. So there's quite a interesting discussion.
It looks like a book that could handle one semester-long seminar in philosophy or political science or... It
Now
requires...
here's a chunk. A provisional rational decalogue. I'm not even sure what that means. The problem with any religious moral code that is set in stone is just that. It's set in stone. Anything can never be changed, has within its DNA the seeds of its own extinction. Yeah. And then it talks about the different principles. The ask first principle, the happiness principle, the liberty principle, the fairness principle.
How about the ask, the do first, ask for permission later principle?
The ask first principle, the golden rule principle has limitation to it. What if the moral receiver thinks differently from the moral doer? What if you would not mind having action X done unto you, but someone else would mind it? Smokers cannot ask themselves how they would feel if other people smoked in a restaurant where they were seen dining because they wouldn't mind. It's the non-smokers who must be asked.
Yeah, right.
So the golden
In order to be fair or moral,
yeah,
those who are without need to be asked as well.
the moral doer should ask the moral receiver
Mhm.
whether the behavior in question is moral or
This has to
immoral.
do with, in a sense, the mainstream majority versus the unseen.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's the reason principle. Try to find rational reasons for your moral actions that are not self-justifications or rationalizations by consulting others first.
Mm-hmm.
Now listen. The biophilia principle. Try to contribute to the survival and flourishing of all
Mm-hmm.
of other sentient beings, their ecosystems, and the biosphere as a whole.
That's a belief in the equality of all species, really. Which, certainly if you talk with poets like Gary Snyder, that's one of the guiding principles of their point of view. The moral universe includes small creatures as well as humans on an equal level in many ways. I don't know if it's just the Buddhist point of view, but it certainly is brought out in Buddhism. And, concepts like Zen, at least writing in Zen. So that the belief that the humans are at the top of the chain, so to speak, is challenged all the time by that there's an equality of, and that's a moral arc, that's a moral equality.
Civilization 2.0, looking into the far future. It gets into a discussion of type 1 civilization, type 2 civilization, type 3 civilization, and all that malarkey. So you could, in the process of typing civilization and thinking about progress over a long period of time, I think you can get tangled up with the typology.
Sure.
And then it sort of begs the question of what's going on.
Well, the question that I guess philosophers ask are exploring the natures of the questions as well as the question itself. What's behind the question?
Here's an interesting way that he winds up the book. We're talking about Dr. King, who said, each of us is two selves. The great burden of life is to always try to keep that higher self in command. And every time that lower self acts up and tells us to do wrong, let us allow the higher self to tell us that we were made for the stars, created for the everlasting, born for eternity. Now, actually, this leads to a discussion
About our higher selves. About our higher selves.
Yeah, a really unfortunate phase in our country, the Japanese-American internment.
I heard George Takei speak about this.
Richard Reeves wrote this book, Infamy, the shocking story of the Japanese-American internment in World War II. And, you know, the more you read this book, the more you're going, what? They just took the people, locked them up. Like I said, now, driving along Southern California on Route 395, people will see a sign, Manizar War Relocation Center, and say, isn't that where they put the Japanese? But the impact is so awful because the Japanese are acutely aware of place. And they were put into these relocation centers guarded by soldiers in machine gun towers. None of them were charged with any crime against the United States. In fact, there was not a single American of Japanese descent, alien or citizen, charged with espionage or sabotage during the war. These women, children, and men, women, and children were locked up for the duration of the war because they looked like the enemy. And that kind of defies the moral arc, you know, where this country just kind of went off. Reeves says the sweeping story of what happened to the American Japanese and the Caucasians who imprisoned them is not a series of isolated events, but a look into a dark side of the American way. It goes back to the treatment of Native Americans, the persecution of British loyalists after the American Revolution, the enslavement of Africans in the New World, the treatment of American Germans during World War I, Jewish quotas and the Irish need not apply, you know, all those, you know, dangers of history repeating itself. But what
And the whole history of Native Americans.
Yeah, well, that's the way I just said, you know, but just what they went through, you think, my God. And that was in this country.
There have been many books in this past 10-year period about this period of incarceration, explorations, artwork, stories, theater. It's, you know, coming out again.
It's just incredible.
I knew a kid my age in college whose parents were incarcerated. You know, he'd be my age now. We were freshmen together.
But nobody violated the law.
No, and nobody questioned. It was several years until, you know, it was finally questioned, and they stopped it in 44 or something, 43. But then people had their complete homes, their lives rounded up, boarded up. They weren't allowed, you know, they didn't take things other than brief amounts of, small amounts of their personal belongings, and their homes were either taken away or, you know, in some cases neighbors watched them, but they had nothing to go. In many cases, most cases, I think, had nothing to go back to. The property was held.
And it was by order of the president. February 19, 1942. Gather them up. put him in prison. And this book, I mean, it was an extraordinary book because he really did the research,
Mhm.
you know, primary and secondary, you know, and it was difficult to get some of the records. You know, people didn't want to let those go. And I found it was quite interesting. Yeah, like you were saying, only what they could carry. That was in Proclamation Number 1, March 2nd, 1942.
Well, the irony is, it's just like what they did with the Jews in the late 30s in Germany, and then throughout the war, of course, with the roundup of people.
It is hereby ordered that all persons of Japanese ancestry, including aliens and non-aliens, be excluded from that portion of military area 1 described as Bainbridge Island in the state of Washington on or before 12 noon, 30 March 1942. So they would mark these places they could not go. You know. And I just thought it was interesting because the details have not come out. It's been a silence about what was going on and what had happened. And these poor people had suffered like that. And it had a lasting impact on all of them. Said that in March 2006, in the Hood River Valley of Oregon, the county's History Museum, with approval of county commissioners, opened an exhibit entitled A Circle of Freedom, Lost and Restored, and included documents and photographs found in a barn by a World War II veteran named Bud Collins, who had become a historian of the American Legion Post 22. He said, you can't turn your back on history. These are the facts.
What were the artifacts that he found? Letters and things of that nature?
2 ample crates of papers.
Was there an internment camp there in Oregon?
I don't know. But this guy had found these papers, and so we wanted to get them out. Well, thank you for being on Rip Rap again.
This was a delight. Yeah. And we solved all the problems of the universe again.
The art.
As usual. The art. We got it done.